We now turn to our second panel session, focusing on the Gulf states' economic transformations and domestic innovation strategies. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Mr. Omar Rahman, who is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, who will lead our next panel. If the panel will go up and sit here. Once again, we welcome questions once the panelists have done with their presentation, but please, questions. Thank you. Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave. This on? Yep. Thank you for that introduction. As you said, my name is Omar Rahman. I'm a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, which is a long-standing partner of the Gulf International Forum. And this has been a few consecutive years now, joining both as a panelist and as a speaker. So I'm glad to be with you. I see a lot of cherished friends and colleagues in the audience. We have a few rounds of questions, and we're going to try to be as concise as possible, keep everybody to, let's say, 5 minutes. We're 3 panelists, so 1 less than last time, so hopefully we get through quicker. And we have Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen online. I'm a little less agile and adept than my colleague, Dr. Tarek, but I try to rule with an iron fist, so we're going to keep it. I've learned one valuable, sacred lesson when you're moderating, and that's don't keep the audience from lunch. And we have another, I think, set of speakers before then, so let's try to get to it as quickly as possible. The topic for this panel is From Dependence to Domestic Engines, New Economic Pathways for GCC Growth. So, of course, there's some overlap with the previous panel. I think we're going to dispense a little bit with the U.S.-Gulf relationship a bit and try to dig deeper into those issues that we were digging in last time. Again, a few rounds of questions, and I'm privileged to be joined by this distinguished panel. First, again, online, we have Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, who's a fellow at the Baker Institute at Rice University in Houston, where he's also the co-director of the Institute's Middle East Energy Roundtable and very accomplished author on the GCC. To my right, I have Dr. Amin Mohseni, a non-resident fellow at the GIF and an economist who has worked across several divisions of the World Bank. And I think we're going to tap your knowledge on that for this. And to his right, Dr. Justin Alexander, the director of Khalij Economics, which is a consultancy dedicated to understanding the GCC and its role in the world. So let me start with Dr. Ulrichsen. You just had your most recent book just came out, Kingdom of Football, if I'm not mistaken, on Saudi's role. So I want to focus on that. Is that your U.S. title as well? Should it be Kingdom of Soccer?
Yes.
No.
Kingdom of Football, and then we have how Saudi Arabia and the remaking of world soccer. So we get both.
Okay.
Both in the title.
Beautiful. I thought there might be some confusion. Saudis entering the NFL, trying to buy a team or something.
Yes.
It's coming.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen an explosion of investment, obviously in football and golf from Saudi, from Qatar hosting the World Cup, and really I think most of the Gulf states are invested in some way or form in sports. So to what extent can mega sports and cultural events be more than just image builders? I mean, we see that component to this in terms of, creating a different image of the Gulf's place in the world and how it engages. But I mean, more as I say, a sustainable economic driver through tourism, through media, through infrastructure, urban regeneration, talent development. I mean, how do you see that going?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm actually in Doha, in Qatar, so it's great to be with you virtually. First of all, sport is very effective at image changing. I mean, that's part of the whole sports washing narrative, even though I don't think it really is fair. You could argue that the Saudi win over Argentina at the World Cup in 2022 did more for Saudi soft power than anything the Saudi authorities could have done. The image of young Saudis celebrating, having fun, being as football obsessed as anyone else just spoke volumes. And it was all spontaneous, organic, genuine. It wasn't contrived. It wasn't top down. It was purely bottom up. So it was incredibly successful. And there's been a huge investment, by the way, also in basketball from the Gulf states, especially from the UAE. Dubai just played their first game in the EuroLeague 2 years after the team was formed. Their Final Four was held in Abu Dhabi this past year. Qatar is holding the World Cup in basketball in 2 years from now. So there's a lot of stuff going on in basketball too. Sports so far has been more of an indirect driver in the sense of drawing attention to wider economic and maybe even social changes taking place across the Gulf, raising the profile of the Gulf as a destination, creating hubs around which the infrastructure of tourism has developed. Obviously, here in Doha, where there was huge investment in hotel building, in the infrastructure of the city for the decade-long preparation for the World Cup, which is still here. It's clearly going to be utilized for other events. We have the Arab Cup coming up in soccer in the next month. That said, it has been hard to ensure a steady pipeline of events, especially events on the scale of a World Cup that will utilize all of the infrastructure. That may be less of an issue in states or in places like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, where there is already a much greater footfall of visitors for other reasons, for sort of mass tourism in Dubai's case. But certainly in the case in Qatar and perhaps in Saudi Arabia, as they develop their infrastructure ahead of the World Cup in 2034, it might be harder to continue to fill the sort of all the venues, the hotels, everything with continuous supplies of visitors. That said, there has been investment in localization of supply chains, of talent bases. It was interesting, we saw the Qatar Stars League at the turn of this century also do what the Saudis have done over the past couple of years, bring in big name soccer players from all over the world for the last couple of years of their career, but then quickly pivot to focusing on hosting, which has been incredibly successful for the Qataris. And I would imagine that maybe the Saudi Pro League might begin to do the same, especially with the decade-long run-up to the World Cup, the Asian Cup in 2027. So I think that the jury is still out. It would be a long-term project. Over time, I think they hope that investment in sport will generate greater tourism. In Qatar's case, numbers are up since the World Cup. So I think that's the plan, and it seems to be going very well, at least so far.
Great, thank you for that. Let me turn to you, Dr. Amin. And let's widen the lens a little bit. Obviously, that was a very pointed question, but what practical steps are being taken or should be taken in the Gulf to diversify away from fossil fuels and foster new economic pathways for the GCC countries?
All right, thank you. Excuse me. Omar, for that question, and thank you, Dr. Dania and GIF for the invitation. So this year's Economic Nobel Prize went to 3 economists just 2 days ago that worked on innovation-led growth and arguing that growth should not be taken for granted, and there should be continuous, as we say, creative destruction happening in economies for growth to continue to happen in the future. So this is true also for the Gulf region. So I want to answer your question in 4 different categories and buckets, if you may. One is the renewable energy. We have, the previous session also talked about this, and probably it's going to come up several more times in today's event. So over the past 5 years, $42.5 billion have been invested in renewable energy in the Gulf region. Still, that is 12% of the ambitious 165 gigawatt by 2030. So much more needs to be done to reach that goal. Specifically, by 2030, we need an additional $60 billion of investment needs to happen. So, and every country in the Gulf, again, we're talking about the GCC countries, sometimes we fall into this trap that there are homogeneous countries with homogeneous economies, but they are not. They are different in size and scale and also their ambitions. So Saudi Arabia aims for 50% renewable by 2030. UAE aims by 30%, both renewable and nuclear mixed by 2031. Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain, they have different ranges ranging from 15% to 30%. So, and the region has a lot of potential in wind and solar, we know that. So that's one area that the region has seized the opportunity to move away from fossil fuel producing nations to next phase of energy in the global economy. But again, much more can be done, and I'm hopeful that they are moving into that direction. The other one is, of course, the artificial intelligence. The background shows that here, and digital infrastructure. Again, the region is going very strongly on these fronts. UAE's strategy 2031 and Saudi Arabia's data and AI authority, for example, are examples of setting up the regulatory environment for the region to move into this direction. We also know, for example, the UAE is building the largest data center outside of the US, 5 gigawatts worth of data center, and so forth. So, and the recent President Trump's trip to the region, we see the executives coming from US industry. The number of people on the AI and digital front exceeded probably other industries in that visit. So that is also a very strong move by the GCC economies, especially UAE and Saudi Arabia. The bottleneck, I think, in that sector is not the investment. The money is there, definitely. The interest is there, is the human capital. In the whole region, I was looking at the numbers as of yesterday. There's only around 12,000 AI experts, specialists, and in order to fuel the rising sector, this rising sector in the region, we need more of that happening, and that goes to the idea of education, but I think it's going to be addressed again later on. The issue of critical minerals came up. That's the third bucket I want to address, and rare earth. And again, we know about China's dominance in this region, in this area, somewhere between 60% to 90%, depending on what we are talking about, like wind turbines, it's around 63%, solar 80%. Some of the minerals, China is monopoly, 100% is coming from China. But again, it's not, and as Karen mentioned very rightfully, the demand is magnificent. And it's not only, and as an economist, we always like, diversify supply chains. We don't like monopolies. It's good for the world economy. It's good for the Chinese companies as well to compete in the global economy. They become more efficient. And it's good for the consumers. So with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other GCC countries going strong again in critical mineral investment, it's good news for the global economy and so on, and also for these economies. And the demand is going to be there moving to the future. And I think the latest numbers is $20 billion investments already in Africa, Canada, Australia, and also Central Asian countries. And in the previous panel, it was mentioned that Saudi Arabia has $2.4 trillion worth of untapped natural reserves for critical earth minerals, which is a huge, opportunity for Saudi Arabia to seize the opportunity. And the last bucket I want to mention is the macroeconomics. Given that these countries have been traditionally dependent on fossil fuel revenues, taxation has been very low, taxation capacity has been very low. Some of the countries in the regions, again, Saudi Arabia is an example, they are taking important steps in increasing their tax revenues, but again, much more needs to be done in that front in order to be able to shift away from fossil fuel revenues, and also depend on the private sector growth, which leads to tax revenues moving to the future. I'll stop right there, and I have probably some more comments on the macroeconomics later on. Yes.
Let me quickly follow up actually on,
Sure.
especially on the AI point of view, because you mentioned the bottlenecks of human capital.
Yeah.
And I think in the previous panel, Karen mentioned that there was some frustration after Trump's visit for NVIDIA's technology or chips to arrive in the region. I think Justin asked that question. So I mean, how hamstrung by these bottlenecks do you think this diversification project into AI is?
I think human capital is a huge issue. As an academician, we always value that ideologically, of course, but also practically. And I think Qatar is making a huge inroad in this with the education city, and also moving into this education in the next generation of experts. But the region has to become very serious in training regional experts. Of course, expats are there, they can always come in. But for creating the jobs necessary, that was my next point I forgot to mention actually. Every year there is a need of 1 million new jobs that needs to be created in the region as a whole. So there are 1 million new entrants into the job market. And of course the public sector does not have the capacity to absorb all of these new entrants. So the only solution will be the private sector. And the private sector is moving towards the digital economy, the AI, the fintech. And that's where their demand is, right? So the region has to train the experts, these 1 million experts, into those fields, so that when they are graduating with degrees in technology and AI and fintech, they can be observed into the region's market. So I think, again, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, I know by experience, they are doing a lot in this front.
Yeah.
And I think other countries also should follow suit.
Obviously, education is a very important component, but
Definitely.
it takes a long time and a large
It does. It's not
long-term
microwave,
investment.
yes.
But attracting, I think, talent is another component to that. Turning to you, Justin, through the lens of economic diversification, I mean, what structural shifts in industrial policy, technology adoption, in high-value sectors, I think, would most redefine GCC economies in the next decade, in your opinion?
So there have been some significant shifts that have already happened in the last. So is my microphone coming on? Is that?
I think they seem all right.
Okay. Some really important shifts that have happened in preparing the business environment over the last 5 or 10 years for innovation and development. We've seen this particularly in Saudi Vision 2030, but also in other countries' plans, making it much easier to start companies, raise capital, access to financing for SMEs. So all of these things. So traditionally in the region, diversification and development has been state-led, and that's still heavily the case, but there is more scope for the private sector. And kind of a composite between the private sector and the public sector. And we see this with some of the sovereign wealth funds, some of the partnerships also with US companies. And I think we've talked about artificial intelligence a bit, and that's going to come up a lot. I think that's a really interesting sector. It's one that wasn't really discussed in the Gulf until a couple of years ago, maybe not widely. It's emerged very rapidly. But the Gulf is incredibly well suited to AI, and they're taking it very seriously. I think there are mainly kind of 5 things you need to implement AI effectively. So you need capital. We've got lots of that in the Gulf, obviously. You need cheap and reliable energy. We have that, not just hydrocarbons. We've got renewables, nuclear power in the UAE. That's creating an environment for that. You need a good regulatory environment, access to land and other resources. Again, that's all much easier to do in the GCC than anywhere else. In my hometown, St. Louis, here in the US, there are massive battles over building new data centers. That's being played out in other places. I know here in Northern Virginia, near DC, there's a lot of data centers. It's just getting the land, concerns about the impact on the local energy market. Those aren't really issues in the GCC. Then you need talent. And Amin, you mentioned this. The Gulf states are working hard on education, and including in AI. The UAE has a specific syllabus for all of its, I think it's maybe as low as kind of sort of kindergarten children and train them in AI. Saudi Arabia doing similar. I think others have plans. They're very digitally literate societies, so they are developing those skills domestically, but they're also working to attract talent. And if you look at some of the indices of talent attractiveness, I wrote a paper for the Gulf Research Centre on this last year. Saudi Arabia, the UAE rank very, very highly, and you see this in terms of the flow of, for example, if you look at LinkedIn profiles and you see people with high qualifications who've changed countries in the last year, very high net inflows into the Gulf. And that includes a wide range of things, but also, I mean, AI is within that. So they have the ability to track the talent. And then the last thing you need technology. And although the Gulf states are trying to develop their own, and you see this in some of the large language models that have been developed domestically, really they need to import that and do partnerships, and that's where the relationship with the US is so critical. And although there has been the rollout of some of the partnerships that were announced in May, including supply of AI chips, have been slower than expected. Those are now happening, and just in the last week or so there have been announcements G42 in Abu Dhabi announced that they're planning on producing the first 200 megawatts of their AI data center campus next year, and they're targeting 5 gigawatts in total. So that was looking specifically at the frame of AI, but more broadly in other sectors, the Gulf states have a lot of the capital, the business environment, the talent attractiveness to encourage innovation.
Just to again follow up very briefly, a lot of the focus is on Saudi Arabia, on Qatar, on the UAE, and much less focus, I think, on the other 3 GCC members. I mean, are there any initiatives or policies from those states that stick out to you that you'd mentioned in terms of diversification over the next decade?
Yes, I mean, and I think so. Within the Gulf, broadly speaking, the country is split into 2 categories. Those which have phenomenal sovereign wealth and hydrocarbon resources, so they don't really need to diversify, and that's Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE.
But surely Kuwait. I mean, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
It doesn't mean they aren't, but they don't need to. And the UAE particularly is very far ahead in a lot of these sectors. Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Bahrain, they have far. If you look at, for example, the sovereign wealth per capita or per national, or the hydrocarbon resources per national, it's a tiny fraction of what it is in the other states, and so they really need to diversify in order to generate revenue for the public sector, to create jobs, and so it's really a life or death thing, and that's why Vision 2030 is so critical to Saudi Arabia. But Bahrain and Oman are also, also very engaged. Oman has sorted out its public sector finances, which were a mess, but they've really transformed them in the last couple of years. And now they're working on improving the business environment and attracting FDI, a lot of it actually from other Gulf states, but also more broadly. And Oman has certain sectoral focuses, hydrogen, tourism, trying to develop some manufacturing. Bahrain has its own capacities. Bahrain has very good human capital, relatively affordable in the Gulf, and so they work in sectors such as kind of business process outsourcing, financial services. And Kuwait is somewhat the laggard in the region in terms of its diversification. Again, it doesn't really need to diversify, but it has its own Vision 2035, and we can talk in detail about it. Maybe I don't want to go on, but they have made some significant reforms in the last year, particularly since they suspended Parliament, which was a kind of a barrier in many ways to getting new laws passed. So yeah, Kuwait has got its own areas as well.
Thank you. Kristian, I kind of left you behind by not following up on my first question, so I'm going to actually follow up and lump it into my second question, if you don't mind. I mean, you mentioned the youth in Saudi Arabia and how engaged and how genuine that is in the sports and cultural festivities aspect of it. I mean, obviously Saudi Arabia stands apart from the rest of the GCC in terms of the size of the country and the population size. I mean, does that make its investments in these sectors more likely to be a sustainable economic driver than the rest of the GCC? That's one part of the question. And then the second thing is, beyond kind of event hosting, how might GCC states deploy cultural diplomacy, that's festivals, exchanges, media, and heritage branding, in ways that attract investment, strengthen soft power linkages, and channel returns into creative economies, tourism, that kind of thing?
Okay, thanks so much.
Sorry to lump a lot on you.
No, thank you. The Saudi case is different, as you say. There's a much more of a demographic challenge that the Saudis need to contend with. And that's why I think, especially in the Saudi case, allegations of sports washing really do miss the mark, because they are connected to very significant economic diversification initiatives that are necessary to try and create jobs for locals, to create sustainable, non-oil, non-energy related sectors. So especially in the Saudi case, I think there is a longer term plan to really integrate the sports, tourism, entertainment, and investment planks of Vision 2030. And we even saw the creation of a sports, tourism, and investment ministries on the same day back in 2020, albeit right before the pandemic really brought everything to a halt for about 18 months. And they've gone into overdrive in many ways since 2022 especially. So I think the Saudi case is different from the other Gulf states just because of the demographic issue you identified. In terms of event hosting or going beyond event hosting in terms of cultural diplomacy, I think part of the objective of bringing people like Ronaldo or hiring Lionel Messi as a brand ambassador for Saudi tourism is to generate awareness on a global scale that something is changing in Saudi Arabia, that there is something called Vision 2030, that the Saudi Arabia people think they may have known about 20 years ago, of 9/11, of human rights, of Yemen, isn't the Saudi Arabia we see today, even if below the surface we still see some of the same structures of political power and of inequality that haven't been addressed. But certainly on a global scale, there's now a buzz about Saudi Arabia. There's a sort of sense of expectation that really you can only get through the mass appeal of sport or maybe some of these mass cultural music festivals as well. I mean, there was obviously the comedy festival in Riyadh, which has drawn a lot of criticism, especially from all quarters, which may have been, I think, more of a risky thing to do, just given that comedy by inherently is political, and trying to draw lines around what can and cannot be said invites a backlash when you do that in Saudi Arabia. But I mean, in terms of generating awareness of the changes, it has been very successful. So in terms of generating expectations that the giga projects at some point, to the extent that they are being built, they will need people to populate them. They will need millions of new residents, potential visitors, investors. Mohammed Salman is on record in 2023 as having said he expects the population of Saudi Arabia to be 50 to 55 million by 2030. Now, that's not going to happen. They're going to find that extra 20 million people in 4 years. But there's an expectation of huge targets. And if those targets are going to be not met, but at least sort of moved toward, there is going to be need to be a real shift in terms of marketing strategies. And that's where I think the investments come in. I mean, the Saudis have also been very ahead of the game in kind of identifying how sport and entertainment increasingly emerging, and they're emerging in ways that appeal to a sort of Gen Z youth who don't maybe have the patience to watch a 90-minute soccer game. Mm-hmm. You sort of package things up in highlights, you stream, people watch at their pleasure. So channels like DAZN, for example, have been very ahead of the game in trying to move into this market. Now, they're still loss-making, I suspect. They haven't yet proven their commercial viability, but I think there were fewer legacy issues in the Gulf to contend with than, say, in European countries and perhaps even in North America itself. So I think those are some of the areas where the Gulf states are moving in. They don't necessarily have first mover advantage, but they have the ability to move quickly and to also identify some of these broader societal shifts that are taking place.
It's a fascinating topic. I wish we had more time to follow up on that question, actually. But I think we only have about 9 minutes left that we need to wrap things up. So I guess I'll follow up with 2 more questions, and unfortunately we won't have time for audience questions. But Dr. Amin, putting your World Bank hat on again, what are the most essential macroeconomic and fiscal reforms that would support sustainable diversification? And how do regional investment linkages factor into the Gulf's long-term economic resilience?
Very good question, Omar, again. So I would like to address this in 3 or 4, maybe if I have time, five again, areas, if possible. So the first one, of course, is fiscal reforms and smart spending. As I mentioned, tax revenues are very low compared to other sources of revenue in GCC. For example, in Saudi Arabia, even with the VAT reforms that they did, increasing the VAT rate to 15% in 2020, the tax revenue is $41 billion additional revenue up to 2025. So that's a drop in the bucket when it comes to Saudi Arabia's economy. So much more needs to be done on this front. And taxation means private sector development. So without private sector, there is no taxation. So again, a move towards developing the private sector, a resilient private sector. And when we say private sector, obviously, it's not going to be as much oil and gas dependent. It has to be dependent on new sources of economic growth. That's the first area that I think the states needs to pay critical attention to. The second one is the major issue of fossil fuel subsidies. IEA mentioned a report in 2023 says that around close to $90 billion have been allocated to fossil fuel subsidies in GCC economies. Of course, Saudi Arabia is the largest one, but that's about 4% of the economy of the region's GDP. Only in 2023, you can add these numbers up in terms of billions. It could get to $1 trillion or surpass that in the past decade. And that is a source of money that could be invested in new sources of technology. So what I call is from brown to green subsidies. We have the brown subsidy on fossil fuel energies. We can transfer those subsidies to green energy technologies and accelerate the development in that sector. Even if we don't transfer the subsidies, removing the fossil fuel subsidies will level the playing field for the green technology. Right? That will make them more competitive. So that's the second area that I think the region has to pay attention to. Of course, UAE has done a lot on this front. Oman has done has taken some serious steps, but again, more needs to be done. And the other area that I would like to mention is because you're short on time, is the regional intra GCC investment. It was mentioned that some countries are not, again, they're at different levels of development. Oman, for example, needs to diversify very quickly at the current ratio of deposit to ratio of production ratio of oil and gas. They probably have a decade or so until their resources are depleted. So they have to diversify very fast. And they have a larger labor force. Other countries that don't have that kind of stress in time. So therefore, intra-GCC investment in the and linkages will help all these economies to tap into each other's, I would say, a comparative advantage and benefit from it. And again, things are being done. For example, right now I understand that the electricity grid between Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and UAE, they're trying to integrate that so that they can benefit from each other's renewable production or other sources of electricity production. And some of the ports are being integrated as well. But again, much more can be done on that front. And last but not least, I mentioned the jobs, that 1 million jobs needs to be created. And as a World Bank right now, that's their main motive and their themes of their meetings, job creation for the youth. And again, the countries in the region have that 1 million target every year for the next decade to create the jobs in the private sector. I'll stop right here.
Thank you for being concise. I appreciate it. Lastly, Justin, turning back to you, let's turn to economic risks. What are the key risks policymakers should address to ensure that that this is a sustainable, locally anchored, innovation-led development in the GCC?
So I think there's a really critical fiscal risk, and Amin mentioned this, particularly where in this period of oil's now down to 61, really for the first time, briefly in May after the Liberation Day, but the first time since 2020. So oil prices are lower, and that could be a strain also for some countries if that persists. So that could eat away at investment. It could may result in the need to raise taxes in certain areas. So the way that's managed could have an impact. And I think, as Amin said, it's really critical that the Gulf states, as they need to consolidate fiscally, they do things like getting rid of inefficient energy subsidies. That's very sticky in many countries, rather than introducing taxes and fees that inhibit innovation. And actually, in the last year or two, several Gulf states, including Oman and actually now Kuwait, have kind of reformed a lot of government fees and charges to take away some of the red tape and cost for businesses. So there's that fiscal risk with low oil prices. I think there's also a risk of policy unpredictability. Although many things Gulf states have been doing in the last couple of years have been very good, there has in the past been sudden shifts, and particularly for companies that want to invest long term, you really need to encourage companies that there is stability of policy. That's an issue here in the US as well for different reasons. Creating incentives and ensuring that those persist. I think that's one of the reasons why it's taken a while for foreign companies to really invest in Saudi Arabia in Vision 2030. I think that's beginning, and for example, the FDI in Saudi Arabia's kind of annual FDI is ticking around 2% of GDP. It's been like that for the last 4 years. Vision 2030 target's almost 6% by 2030. It is beginning to pick up, and I think one of the reasons is companies are beginning to feel more confident that policy is stable and will persist for an extended period. So yeah, the fiscal risk and then the unpredictability risk. I think the geopolitical risks are not such a concern. That's often been something that's weighed over the region. But this year we saw really the worst case scenario that many people have feared with the conflict with Iran, and it had minimal impact on the GCC. So I think that reduces some of that risk.
Stability of policy, what a thought, beautiful thought. But yeah, I think it takes time to demonstrate to the market and to investors that policy will be stable and that you're a safe place to invest. It is 11:39. I promised the organizers that I would bring this ship to an immediate halt at 11:40. So I think we'll leave it there. Unfortunately, we don't have time for final thoughts, I guess. But I'm doing my duty. So thank you, everybody, and let's thank our wonderful panelists for this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Kristian.